Hi, I'm Kenneth Sewell, Vice President for Research at Oklahoma State University, welcoming you to this month's edition of OSU Research on Tap. Each month, I sit down with an OSU scientist, artist, or scholar for an informal chat in front of a live audience at Stillwater's Iron Monk Brewery. This is a great way to get a glimpse into the fascinating research these talented individuals carry out at OSU. I hope you enjoy this edition and tune back in each month for a new one. Cheers. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you here to Stillwater's own Iron Monk Brewery and Tap Room for another edition of OSU Research on Tap. So my name is Kenneth Sewell. I'm the Vice President for Research at OSU, and I am thrilled to be a part of an organization that does so many great things for the community, so many great things for the state and the world through the groundbreaking research that takes place at OSU. I love a good crowd, so please don't worry about going up and grabbing a beer or getting in line or whatever you need to do. We'll do that all the way throughout. We'll take a little break halfway through to make sure to remind you to do that as well as we go. So here in our third year of OSU Research on Tap, we have a very special guest today. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Liesel Ritchie of the Department of Sociology. So help me welcome Dr. Ritchie. So we're going to talk today about, our title is very kind of broad, but we're going to dive into it narrowly. But our title today is Resilience Matters. But before we get into that, you know, this sociology, I'm a psychologist, right? So there's an old joke. The first sociologist I ever met told me a joke. He said, you know the difference, you know how to tell the difference between a sociologist and a psychologist, don't you? He knew I was training to become a psychologist. Like, how do you tell? I know. And he said, well, by the look on their face. Okay, I don't get it. He said, no, psychologists always go around with this dour look on their face because they think they're helping people. And sociologists know they can't help anyone, so they just have a happy look on their face.
That's the face.
So I'm not sure that that's correct or not, but I think people do have a better sense about what a psychologist does, particularly a clinical psychologist like myself, than maybe sociologists. So before we get into the whole disaster and resilience realm, kind of give us an idea of what the domain of sociology is and your work as a sociologist.
Right. So the domain of sociology tends to deal with groups of people and interactions. And interactions between those groups. So we're dealing, rather than psychologists at a micro level, we're dealing at either a meso level, a middle level, or a macro level.
So more the groups as opposed to the individuals. Yeah, gotcha. Well, now I first came to know you as a disaster sociologist, someone who came in after something horrific had happened at in a community and tried to understand what was going on. Now you're doing resilience. Explain to me that how you go from disasters to that concept of resilience.
Sure. So I did my dissertation research on the Exxon Valdez oil spill.
That was a disaster.
It was, and I entered the community of Cordova, Alaska there, which is considered ground zero for the spill, about 10 years after it happened. So what I was doing was looking at the long-term impacts of the oil spill. And I started my interest in resilience there, actually, trying to figure out the people who did well and seemed to be thriving as opposed to just surviving following the spill, and what they were doing differently, how they were interacting with each other, how they were taking time away from the community. And then over the years, after studying several disasters, including the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, I felt like I could take what I'd learned by studying the impacts of disasters and put that in on the front end. And so look at social impact assessment work associated with oil and gas development activities, for example, but other community development activities. And we got started doing that with the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline project up in Canada, where we were invited in to do a social impact assessment for a community there. And it just kind of flowed from there, taking again what we'd learned from our research and trying to use that to help communities on the front end. so that in the event that something happened, that they would be prepared, that they would be resilient.
So resilience is one of those concepts that it's used in a lot of different sciences, actually, even used in physics, like in material science. And you take a particular substance and how resilient is it? Can it bend? Can it retake its first shape? But when we're talking about communities, what is resilience? What do we mean when we say a community is resilient?
Right. So when we're talking about a community, we're looking at a community's ability to anticipate, to absorb, and adapt to shocks and stressors, whatever those shocks and stressors might be.
Like a football game that doesn't go as well as it should have on a Saturday?
That could definitely be a shock and a stressor. But actually, that's a really good example because we hear the term resilience all the time. You know, families that have a tragedy are resilient when they get interviewed by newspapers. Those are the kinds of words that they use. Athletes are considered resilient. We hear that from broadcasters. Teams are resilient. So yeah, it's a concept that translates very broadly.
But we do have kind of almost simplistic concepts, you know, maybe memes that go around on our social media. You know, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and I'm not sure I've ever believed those things. But so really, when you dig down into a community, then what are the pieces of this resilience that you work with as a sociologist?
So the pieces that I and others in the social sciences work with, there are 7 forms of what we call community capital.
Community capital. So
right.
I think of capital like money.
Right. So financial capital is one of those.
Okay.
We have natural resource capital. We have built infrastructure capital. But we also have some other forms of capital, including human capital. We have political capital. We have cultural capital. And we have social capital.
Social capital.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was with you all the way there. Political capital, I do a lot of politicking in my work. Physical capital, infrastructure, what's social capital?
Social capital has to do with networks, associations, and trust between people and groups and organizations in communities, which we have a lot here of in Stillwater, from what I can tell. I've only been here for a couple of years, but the community ties and the associations and the relationships between people seem to be very strong.
So when you go into a community and you just told me beforehand, and as the Vice President for Research, I really appreciate when I hear this, that you just submitted a grant proposal just today to study resilience and to do a study. But so when you go into a community, you've got a fly that loves you. When you go into a community to do a study like this, what do you actually do? What does a study like this look like? So if I'm your research assistant, now the fly likes me. So if I'm your research assistant or your research associate, what do we do in that community to study resilience?
So 2 of the studies and the research projects that I've been involved with in the last few years, one was with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the other was the National Academy of Sciences. And the NIST project involved developing a community resilience planning guide. And NIST focused mainly on the built environment, but they called me in as a sociologist to make sure that the social dimensions of resilience were captured in what they were doing. And the other project with the National Academies was developing measures and metrics associated with community resilience, and they covered all of those different capitals that I just mentioned. One of the projects, the one that I submitted today, has to do with disaster preparedness in community-based organizations, particularly food banks.
Food banks.
Right. So the proposal went into Feeding America, that has a nationwide network of food banks, and we would be focusing on the Midwest, focusing on their disaster preparedness and planning and response capabilities.
So when you're going in to look at the built environment, like the NIST project, you're looking at building codes and adherence processes and like old versus new construction? Are you that the level of analysis for that sort of thing? But then when you're, say, developing measures and metrics, what is that? So, pulling out the measuring stick, how do you measure this sort of thing?
So, for example, with social capital, the kinds of things that we're looking at there have to do with these trusts and networks and associations. Yeah. So a lot of that involves collecting primary data. So going into communities, you might do interviews, you might do focus groups, you might do surveys, You might do workshops to better understand what's going on at a community level. So there's a lot of qualitative work that goes on.
So qualitative, you ask people what they think about things and
Right, right.
try to understand and organize what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of the other forms of capital, for example, when we talk about the social dimensions of resilience, one of the things, just like we need to understand in the built infrastructure about weaknesses and vulnerabilities, we need to understand the same things in communities. We need to understand where the vulnerable populations might be, the at-risk populations, but we also need to understand, more importantly, I think, the capabilities that exist in communities and the ways that communities come together in the face of a disaster or hazard events.
So we're kind of talking in the abstract here. You know, and I've lived a bit of my life in New Orleans that's had its share of disasters, and certainly you can't be in any kind of gathering in New Orleans for more than just a few minutes before somebody will bring up what a resilient community they perceive New Orleans to be, and I think it's a well-deserved distinction. But also Stillwater is a bit of a laboratory in a sense. We've certainly the Stillwater community, the OSU community has undergone some traumatic events at the community level. So let's say that Stillwater community leaders hire you and say, come into Stillwater, bring your dream team. Help us be super resilient. Make us super resilient. So first of all, would you take that on? And then if so, who would you bring in, and what would we be doing over the course of the next year or so as a community with you and your colleagues making us super resilient? What would we do to get better at this thing?
So the first thing that I would do is recommend bringing together the community's formal and informal leaders. So before going outside the community, getting a better handle on what's going on inside the community. And I and the team of researchers, sociologists, I would call on graduate students, I would call on colleagues in the Department of Sociology and other departments in the social sciences to really get a handle on what's going on here in Stillwater. I think the next thing that I would do.
So formal leaders, mayors, city council, et cetera.
Right.
What do you mean by informal leaders? What might that be?
Right. So we tend to term informal leaders perhaps as church leaders, representatives of community-based organizations, even though they have their own formal networks. We don't necessarily always turn to them, and as we know from research, those organizations tend to be the pillars of society, particularly in smaller communities, so we would draw upon those. But there are also other people, when you get into communities, who are identified as leaders, even though they might not hold any kind of
Well, I
formal
certainly
title.
think about that in my time in New Orleans. There are community leaders that have no particular title, but from the Ninth Ward or from particular areas of the city. And maybe we have some of that here that you'd have to find out about.
Right, right. And I've lived in communities that were small enough that you could go down to the local coffee shop and find those informal leaders because they were making big plans over coffee.
Okay, all right. So you find the movers and shakers, the formal and informal leaders, and then what do you do with this?
Well, typically in the community we need a champion. There's typically 1 to 2 individuals in a given community that are interested in focusing on resilience. And it takes that kind of energy of a local champion to really bring to bear the resources, not only the financial resources, but the other forms of resources and capital that we've talked about already. And then what I would do is call in, as you suggested, my dream team.
Your dream team.
The
Okay.
dream team.
So who's this?
I can name several of them. I guess this is going to be available for broadcast and for consumption later.
Well, you don't have to say their names if you don't want to.
I don't mind.
Tell
but
us the
I
kinds of
love
people they are.
volunteering
All right,
my
yeah.
friends.
Yeah.
So geographers, I would invite urban planners, I would invite other sociologists, I would invite people from the engineering world, certainly, people who deal with natural resources, across all of these different forms of capital. And one of the things that I would recommend is that we draw from the community on campus here at OSU, because there's a wealth of talent and scholarly work that's going on here that I think could help in terms of building resilience.
So I just realized we've been talking about resilience almost in the abstract. Do you need to have a guess at what we're protecting against? Like, I mean, obviously we could have droughts here, we can have, I started to say hurricanes. We can't quite have hurricanes, but it seems like we have every other natural disaster here.
Yeah.
Certainly have tornadoes and earthquakes and so forth, but then human-made insults to our integrity. Does it matter what you're preparing for, or is it just resilience?
Well, one of the first questions we tend to ask when we're talking about resilience is resilience to what and for whom? And so your question is well taken. The other piece of resilience is that there are individuals and scholars who say we can do an all hazards approach so that it doesn't matter what hazard we're actually trying to buffer against. So the debate is ongoing about that. I think one of the things that we would do, first of all, is do a risk assessment and involve the experts in what kinds of risk we're really facing here. And thinking about that, you know, we've already dealt with floods, we've already dealt with some local tragedies, we've got ice storms, we've got other kinds of things. Of course, tornadoes would be some of them. But I think that risk assessment and bringing people together to identify what they're most concerned about is something that's going to be really important. And then following that, determining what's most important, seeing what kinds of resources are available. So doing an inventory, again, of capacities and of potential vulnerabilities to those different kinds of hazards. And again, looking very particularly at for whom, you know. There are a lot of us who have a lot of resources and might be able to get up and go, and others
Leave if we just
right.
go live somewhere else if it got too tough here.
Right. And even the ability to evacuate is not necessarily something that is across an entire community. So thinking about those things is something that would be really important in that year or so that you're bringing people together. The Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities initiative is a good example of that. They selected 100 cities from around the world that applied to be part of this program. They infused $1 million in each community to develop resilience programs and to fund a chief resilience officer in each of those communities. And interestingly enough, those communities weren't looking necessarily at just disasters as we think of disasters, but they were also thinking about economic hazards. They were thinking about health hazards. So they expanded the concept of resilience to include those things.
Okay, so I'm not a community leader, and I'm not a informal mover and shaker. I'm not the person down at the coffee shop solving all the problems.
But you'd be on my team.
No, okay. Well, I'm not really talking about. I'm talking about an abstract me, a hypothetical me. So I'm an electrician, and I get up every day and I go to work for a local electrical company and do my job and come home and try to put food on the table. And so, what would I notice about this year, or whatever our preparation time, when we're becoming super resilient? What would change, or what would I notice in my life?
Well, nothing would probably change in the immediate future. You know, these programs that are intended to build resilience around the country and around the world, they take a long time, and they don't come without a price tag either. But hopefully that electrician, you as a leader, would come to the table, be part of these workshops, and make sure that the voices of not just the leaders that are informal and formal are heard, but those throughout the community and diverse populations would be heard. And ideally, that electrician would be at the table and share that information with his or her colleagues, friends and neighbors, and just through the broader networks that individual might have.
Okay, so now we've made ourselves super resilient. So Stillwater gets the gold star for super resilient work. We've brought you and your dream team in. We wrote the check, whatever that was, not just to you, but you know, you said these things don't come free, but you know, we've invested in resilience. Maybe a disaster doesn't come. Obviously, you know, we all pay for insurance policies that we hope we never have to use. But is that what this is? Is this like becoming more resilient? Is it only affect us if we then have a catastrophe or a disaster to be resilient against? Or is there some other benefit that communities get out of becoming more resilient?
That's a great question, and it's asked all the time, particularly with respect to, the political cycles. Is it going to happen in the next couple of years? If it doesn't affect
Why
me,
would I want to pay for it?
Right, exactly. But we do have evidence to show that community well-being is improved. The quality of life is improved by pulling people together, helping people whose paths might not cross interact with one another. And so the quality of life in communities tends to improve. And the economic welfare of a community tends to improve as well.
So it's almost like when I think at the physical level, being more resilient to the flu might just be being a more healthy person.
Right.
And so being more resilient to some of these things that could happen to us as a community is, in some ways, just becoming a more healthy community.
Yeah,
could help
you're
us
right.
do that.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. All right, we're going to take a little bit of a break here, and we're going to shift gears just a bit in a minute and open up for conversation. Very fascinating stuff. I keep finding ways to slide a little joke in here and there. And other than the catastrophe of Saturday's football game, I've got nothing. So I certainly don't want to talk about any other, project any other catastrophes. But okay, so just to mention, beyond the local brews, there are other soft drinks and sodas and so forth. We also have, oh look there comes the beer that's coming. I got so enthralled in the conversation, I didn't.
I better drink up.
I got to start drinking my beer. I'm trying to model good behavior, because part of why we take this little break here is because everybody gets so intense on our conversation that you forget there's a bar up there that we're being hosted by the Iron Monk Brewery. So I don't want you to forget that. I also want to say a thank you to our refreshment sponsors. The Riata Center for Entrepreneurship at Spear School of Business at OSU has brought some refreshments in. I don't think they're all gone, so there's some snacks over there if you want to grab some of those during the break or a little bit thereafter. A few announcements associated with Iron Monk right here at Iron Monk. We have Pub Poll Tuesdays. If you've never participated in that, it's a fun form of a trivia contest they do here on Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock. Come check that out. This month we have a community kegs event that is coming up on Thursday at 4 o'clock. I forgot to ask who that's benefiting. Can somebody yell and tell me who the community kegs is benefiting this month? Okay, maybe we'll find that information later. There's yoga in the tap room. If you've never been here with Lana for yoga in the tap room, it's a pretty interesting experience that you should take advantage of. That's at 10:30 in the morning on Saturday. For all things Iron Monk, check out their Facebook page or Instagram. You can find out what kind of music, comedy, various things are going on right here. Also, same bat time, same bat channel. Next month, right here in Iron Monk, we'll have another installment of OSU Research on Tap. I'll save that as a teaser to tell you who that's going to be when we come back after the end of the program today. Okay, you feel that exhale everybody does? So we've been talking now, and now we're going to bring it back. I'm not going to ask people to be quiet. They will eventually figure it out and come back to things. But anyway, so back to Dr. Ritchie. So thank you for letting us know what's been going on with you, what kind of work you're doing. So what I want to kind of finish my questions with, and then we'll open up for conversation with the audience, is what's in the future? Where do you see this all leading, both for your research and the program of your research, but also this entire field of resilience and community resilience? Where are we heading with this?
So with respect to the broader field, I think what we're looking at now that we've recently developed, and it's just been within the past year, these measures and metrics associated with community resilience, is actually testing them.
Testing them.
Yeah, so going into
measures.
communities and working with community members, just like I talked about we might do here in Stillwater, to do a baseline assessment of where they are with respect to these different forms of
for many years they've been doing these assessments, impact assessments for, say, putting a dam over here or building a road over there. And you're talking about doing impact assessments for communities for what if this happens, what if that happens.
Right, right. Because the real question is, I mean, we don't know to what extent a community is actually resilient unless something happens.
That's the scary part.
Right.
We don't want to really test this.
No, we really don't. But we would test the measures and to see the extent to which those things are actually measuring what we think they're measuring. So that would be the first thing. One of the other things that I personally would like to do is continue to do this social impact assessment work. Now that we have these measures and metrics, we can help communities to better understand what their vulnerabilities are, what their capacities are, and how to work to fill any gaps with respect to where the vulnerabilities are, and how to capitalize on the issues related to their capacities.
You know, there's a lot of towns where people live, and then there are communities. And so what you seem to be talking about is helping towns where people live become true communities, and that somehow not only buffers them against rough times that could come, but also just makes it a better place to be.
It does. Yeah, that's the idea.
All right. So I've had my fun. Let's open it up to you guys. If you've not experienced this before, many of you are old timers at OSU Research on Tap, but we have the orange bouncing ball that we try not to bounce, but it is actually a microphone. So if you would like to ask Dr. Ritchie a question, please, we'll find you here, and then please tell us who you are and before you ask a question, and we'll get you an answer. And talk into the bouncing ball if you don't mind.
Okay, I'm talking into the bouncing ball.
And we can hear you. That's awesome.
So my question...
You've already forgot. Tell us who you are.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm Nancy Kaplow. So a question came to my mind during your interaction, and maybe it's orthogonal to your research, and maybe you'll tell me that other people study this.
Usually I have to stop the person up here when they use a fancy term. Now I have to stop you. Orthogonal. Not related?
Not in the same direction.
Okay, there we go. I'm sorry.
So Dr. Sewell mentioned that in New Orleans, you don't have to be talking to a group of people for very long before the topic of resilience comes up. And I thought, well, what about the people who aren't there? They're not participating in that discussion about resilience. And so I'm wondering, when you assess communities, do you ever find the people who are no longer in the community? Do people examine those who have not withstood the disaster and who have left, and how does that factor into consideration?
Sure.
Great question.
Nancy, that's a really, really great question. And I've actually been involved. I've had the opportunity to work on a study following Hurricane Sandy in the New York area and looking at buyout programs and people who evacuated and did not come back. Those communities are typically really, really hard to keep track of. And so it's very rare to find studies that actually follow people. There were some following Katrina, though. There were some studies of families and children and mothers in particular who moved away, who were relocated to the Colorado area, which is where I was a couple of years ago, and to Houston, and unfortunately for them to Houston, and to Baton Rouge, for example. But those studies are really challenging. They're very expensive to do, but it's very helpful for us to understand why they left and the impacts of them having to leave on their families and individuals.
Thank you. Next question. Somebody sneaking up from behind? I don't know. Oh, here we go.
My name's Blaine Bowers, and I would. You mentioned that you work with Exxon Valdez and that population. Could you talk a little bit about historical trauma? One would assume that population would have a lot of experience with historical trauma and how that impacts resilience in those communities.
So that's a really great question as well. When I went into the field following the Exxon Valdez oil spill, again, it was about a decade later, and I was following on to a quantitative study that had been doing survey work in the community. And when I went there to help the individuals who were carrying out this research, what I learned was from community members that they were tired of filling out surveys that asked them on a scale of 1 to 5 how they were feeling or how their families were doing. And so I shifted into qualitative research. So I did interviews in the community there. And what they recounted to me over the years was the fact that the spill at one point sort of became the non-issue for them, and it turned into the fact that there was such ongoing litigation and that individuals were actually being traumatized by the litigation associated with the spill. And I had one person tell me it was the hit that keeps on hitting, you know, that they would go to their mailbox and there was another request for paperwork. So those kinds of things built up over the years, and the litigation was not settled until about 20 years later, and we had some National Science Foundation funding to follow the trauma associated with the litigation and the outcome of that. We had people say, with respect to the social capital in the communities, you know, those networks and the associations, that their warriors were tired, that they had been battling with the oil spill litigation for so long that they didn't have the energy to do much else. And so that drew down on their social capital. People decided to leave the community when they could. Many said that they couldn't afford to leave and that they couldn't afford to stay. So that was a really traumatic situation for them. And then newcomers to the community also had some challenges, because they would come in and they would say, what's wrong with this community? There's such underlying, and what I came to term white noise, that with every community event, it was brought up, and very much like this conversation associated with Katrina, you couldn't spend very much time there without having someone bring up the oil spill. And then the other thing that happened was we were in the field in Cordova, Alaska, right during the Exxon Valdez anniversaries, but we also had the opportunities, unfortunately, to be in the field when the Deepwater Horizon hit. And that was one of the most heart-wrenching things that I had ever seen as a disaster sociologist. It essentially looked like people had seen ghosts when we would talk to them. We also heard people say, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be down there? You know, we'd been coming for a really long time. And so we said, yeah, we're on it, and subsequently received some National Science Foundation funding so that we could compare the impacts of the oil spill in Alaska to the Deepwater Horizon.
I'm Andrew Ranson. I'm one of those non-official leaders with the Regional Food Bank and Our Daily Bread Food and Resource Center. And so I'm very curious about, I know you just applied for the grant, so you know, we're not there yet, but I'm curious about how you might involve the local food and resource folks in that discussion of disaster preparedness.
Sure. So if we're fortunate enough to receive this funding, what we'll be doing is working with the regional food banks, so in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, elsewhere in the Midwest, and looking at their disaster plans and preparedness, as I mentioned. But we'll also be working with the agencies that they work with, and I just learned the difference between the food banks and the agencies, or the pantries, for example. And so we would be reaching out to them as well as to the beneficiaries, and determining the extent to which the disaster planning is actually helping what's going on at the local level, and the extent to which people feel like what's going on at the regional level is actually having an impact on what's going on at the local level. So I may be calling you.
I know where he is. So you can...
That's great.
Hi, Liesel. This is Ron.
I can't see you, but I know.
Behind the bright
Okay.
I know where you are.
So this may come off as negative, and I don't mean it to be that, so I'm going to give a little preamble, okay? So we've talked about Exxon Valdez. We talked about Katrina, even Stillwater being resilient, but these are kind of one-time events. Think about a place like Moore, Oklahoma, which I don't know exactly, but in the last 25 years, it's been hit 5 times maybe by tornadoes. So you talk about capital and social capital. Can that capital be a negative? Should we are there certain places where resilience is a bad thing? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
I think so. Now, with respect to tornadoes, I don't think it's quite as certain as some of the other things that we've studied. But for example, rebuilding in floodplains is not a good
I mean,
idea.
The same issue has come up around New Orleans after Katrina.
Right.
Is this a place we need a city?
Right.
That's what I'm thinking
Yeah.
with like Moore. I mean,
Yeah.
if I lived in Moore, I'd be gone. I financially can afford it. So again, I don't want this to be negative, but is there a point where it's like, this is not a good place for a community?
Right, and again, we used very often issues related to floodplain management and rebuilding in flood zones as an example of things that shouldn't happen. We see it down on the Gulf Coast as well with very nice homes, people who can afford to rebuild, but should they be rebuilding, for example, out on Dauphin Island in Alabama. You know, those kinds of places.
Using our federally subsidized flood insurance to do so, by the way, but.
True,
Yeah.
true. So it is a very good question, and it's a question that we in the disaster research arena are asking ourselves. The other thing that happens is we get this phenomenon called a disaster subculture, where people get used to the disasters striking, and they come together and they pull together and they stay in the same place, but again, to what end? So it's a good question that I don't really have a very good answer to, but I think that you know, we're tied so closely to our home place, to our environment. You know, these folks, for example, in Cordova, people have said, well, why don't those 2,500 people just move away? You know, why don't they go get different jobs? You know, if the commercial fishing industry has collapsed, why are you staying there? But think about your own home and your own community and your own neighbors and your own networks. How easy would it be for you to just pick up and leave because things got a little rough? You know, and I'm not saying Moore had it just a little rough, but those kinds of things are the things we think about when we consider people relocating in the face of a disaster.
Dr. Ritchie, Gary McKean.
Hi.
If you do a community assessment for that area to determine their social capital or whatever that's in there, and you come to some conclusion, is that information valid for any type of disaster, whether it be a natural disaster or an economic disaster, or can that same information apply across the board to what type of disaster occurs?
Sure. So yes, it should be applicable. You know, we're talking about measures that are broad enough that they would cover a range of hazards, and we should be able to use them to inform decision making at the local level and at the regional level, at the state levels. So yes, that information should be fed back into the community where decision makers and residents can have a say in what happens next.
Obviously, some kinds of disasters are going to impact one type of resilience more, or one type of that capital more than the other. Mm-hmm. But in terms of that overall community response, the goal is to have measures that inform across the board.
Right. And what we do know, I've worked with FEMA, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and when I have worked with them, I ask what things are the most important when you see a community respond well in the face of a disaster. And to a person, they have always said essentially social capital, the relationships that we have within the community and the relationships that we have outside the community. So we call that bridging social capital. So outside aid can be brought in. So those kinds of things, particularly social capital, is integral to being resilient.
Hi Liesel, this is Rebecca, and I had a question about social impact assessments as well as human rights impacts assessments and how those two are interrelated and how that applies to your own work. I'm not exactly, I don't know these two aspects very well in terms of resilience and in terms of planning for disaster, but it seems like particularly when we think about New Orleans and we think about other places, this idea of a right to return to someone's home, and you were just mentioning the idea of how attached to place we are, but there's other aspects of human rights that seem to dovetail with social impacts, but also maybe also are different as well. Obviously, there wouldn't be two different kinds of impacts. If you could speak to that some.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. One of the things that we have done is, again, look at this Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline project that was up in British Columbia. And it was way, way up there. We were hired by a community called the Gitgat First Nation, and that was in Hartley Bay. And there were a total of about 250 people who lived there. And one of the things that we were asked to do was the social impact assessment. But what we found when we went into the community was that there was a lot of cultural impact associated with this potential project, and that people ended up not being so concerned that there might be a disaster, but the project itself created stress in the community. They were asked to give up essentially their way of life. And so I'm not really familiar with using the term of the human rights impact, but I think what you're talking about is these cultural impacts and these traditional ways of life and local environmental knowledge that we don't heed very often. But one of the things I mentioned, there were some heart-wrenching things that I've experienced, but one of the most powerful things that I've also experienced in the field was this Gitgat community saying, you can't buy us off. There is not enough money for Enbridge to pay for our way of life being lost. And I think that is something that we should all think about as we are moving forward and trying to decide where we want to invest our resources and how we want to make sure that our culture, whether it's the Stillwater culture, whether it's the OSU culture, or the combination thereof, and how we want to go about maintaining and sustaining that over time.
You know, as I said, as we get one last question here, I'll interject. As a psychologist, I've done a lot of work in the field of trauma. And it's like, when does a bad experience constitute a trauma? And it's sort of an analogous. It's when does a catastrophe in a community constitute a disaster? Mm-hmm. And there does seem to be that sense of it has to do with the breaking point. Mm-hmm. When does that experience for the community or for the person exceed that coping capacity? Right. And as much as we might prepare, it may still be that all people, all communities may still have their breaking points. Mm-hmm. But there's the possibility of repair, and that's what's kind of. So one last question, and we'll wrap up.
My name is Elise Rodman. So it's kind of a two-part question. So one is like, have you dealt with both natural and more like human-caused or like technical disasters?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
And then the second part of it is like, is the way that you build resilience or the way that resilience is like useful different depending on what the disaster is?
And we talked about this quite a bit when we were getting together. Yeah.
I tend to focus on technological or human-caused events, actually. So my career has looked at, as I mentioned, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, a number of other oil spills, the BP Deepwater Horizon event, the Tennessee Valley Authority coal ash spill back in 2008. But I've also studied natural events, including the earthquake in Haiti, the earthquake series in New Zealand. I've had some peripheral involvement with Hurricane Katrina studies, but also with Hurricane Sandy. And the way we think about resilience in those contexts isn't all that different. You know, we do the risk assessment a bit differently, but in terms of a community being resilient, we still need to think about those 7 different kinds of capital and how those manifest themselves in the community. So does that answer your question?
Well, we got a few things to wrap up, but before that, help me thank Dr. Ritchie for this great talk.
Thank you.
So before I talk about Research on Tap next month, I can make a prediction that next month at Research on Tap, I will have several people here to help me out, but none more important and reliable than Kevin McCroskey right here, who just snapped a picture. Been at every Research on Tap, keeps everything going smoothly. And I want to thank Kevin and ask you to thank him too. Now, the Division of Research, if we do anything, we do swag. So we have a few things that we'd like to find a way to give away. Now, some of you may know we have at OSU, we have what we call our Tier 1 research initiatives. And so there's 4 of them, and I want to see if we might have people who are somehow connected to each of the 4 Tier 1 research initiatives and see if they can go away with a little swag. So is anybody here at all connected with the unmanned systems, the drone initiative? Look there, there's a drone guy. He's not really a drone guy, but he's connected with our drone guys. So he goes, yeah. All right, is anyone here connected with our opioid initiative? Very much led out of the Center for Health Sciences in Tulsa. So it might be the harder one to get a connection with. We might have some, Ron, you don't get anything. You're behind that light, I would have caught you earlier. So we need some opioid people at our next Research on Tap. What about the microbiome initiative? There we go, right over here, the microbiome initiative. So, believe it or not, if you've not ever been at a Research on Tap when we're talking about the microbiome, you think we're crowded tonight, get us in here talking about E. coli and we will pack the place out, okay? All right, and then finally, last but not least, who is connected with the rural initiative? Oh, come on. Really? All right. There we go, right there. So thank you all for being here. We do have one last announcement. Next month, Research on Tap, to follow Dr. Ritchie's incredible talk to us about community resilience. Our topic is going to be brought to us by Dr. Mike Davis from the College of Veterinary Medicine in the Physiological Sciences Department. Saw a couple of heads nodding already. So Mike is going to talk to us about how to make your dog fatigue-proof. So today we're talking about how to make your community disaster-proof. Next month we're going to talk about how to make your dog fatigue-proof, and Mike is going to talk to us about findings from 2 decades of sled dog research. Works with Iditarod sled dogs, amongst other elite athlete animals. So that's next month, November 18th, right here at 5:30. We also want to induct Dr. Ritchie into the Guild of OSU Research on Tap speakers and give her the OSU Research on Tap medallion, which is the OSU logo, and if you look closely, a bottle opener for OSU Research on Tap. So thank you. So until next month, we finish with a toast. This toast is inspired by the review criteria of the National Science Foundation. May your intellect be meritorious and your impact be broad.
Indeed. Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
See you next month.